And now I won't be seeing the chat, so if there's any questions or comments there, you just let me know if there's something that. Mm-hmm. Can I? Let's see. So one of these. Yeah. Let's see. How about if I do that? Is that better? Right. It's the phone. Okay. Yeah. My own Zoom at all. Yeah. Okay. And now I'm trying to figure out which screen do I need to share so that I share the correct one. That one. Yes. Does that look all right on Zoom? Just all right. Yeah. So I should rather stay on this side of it. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Oh, there's one more thing that I could maybe activate. Then we can make it easier to stand on that side. So the clicker for the slides, I can stay on this side of it. Wow, that is loud. I think I'll just use the manual. It's less annoying sounds. It's not very far either. Okay, how's the time? Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Oh, yeah. And then joining us for this seminar from ETH in Stockholm. So really interesting presentation of design that really relevant for this people.
Great.
So yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Since I'm already been that's the sound then. I've already been introduced. There we go. So I will be presenting work today that we've conducted together with my fellow PhD, Petra Jääskeläinen. You cannot see the slides because the Zoom is right there in the middle. Let's try that. My supervisor, Anna-Kaisa Kaila, and my co-supervisor, Bob Sturm. And the research questions that we are, I'm trying to get rid of that annoying sound in some way. Yeah, that should do it. So the research questions we are broadly working with relate to what could be ethical creative AI and how could we possibly get there. And some of the sub-questions that we are thinking about at the moment on top of that are what kind of problems do artists currently see with creative AI tools that they have, and what kind of strategies are they adopting to cope with those issues? And secondly, how could we help developers strive towards more ethical creative AI in their work? So in this talk, I will introduce 3 case studies. I will first tell a little bit about interviews that we've conducted with AI artists, and we'll be focusing on the motivations that they expressed in their for the use of AI in art. Secondly, I will outline one of the critical case studies that we've conducted in the field of AI music, using as an example a system called folk-rnn, which you might have heard of before. And finally, I will tell you about EASE, which is an ethics evaluation tool for creative AI developments. And when I'm talking about AI, I basically mean here it could be all more broadly many different types of data-driven tools and processes that are available for computational creativity. But let's start with the interviews first. So we conducted 19 interviews with AI artists from Nordic countries. These interviews were conducted between spring last year and spring this year. And we covered a long list of topics in these interviews, but I will be focusing today basically on the question of what motivated these artists to engage with AI in their creative work. We had artists between ages 29 and 65, so it's a fairly broad age range. Gender-wise, we're not quite as diverse, unfortunately. We have 13 artists that wanted us to address them with pronoun he, 6 with pronoun she, and unfortunately none with pronouns other or they. But we did have different domains represented. So we have artists from music domain, visual arts, installations, performance arts, and so on. And if you look at the list of artistic domains as defined by the artists themselves, interestingly, there's several that are kind of definitions that are kind of diffuse, like contemporary artists or interdisciplinary artists, even one hybrid artist. And particularly notable is that none of them would describe themselves as AI artists. So they would say that, yes, they used AI in their processes, in their artistic work, but they don't feel as an AI artist. And I think this is an interesting find, but I also think that this is something that could be in transition change, that what we think of as an AI artist is in a process of emerging. So it might be different results in a year or two. We analyzed these results, these interviews, with bottom-up thematic analysis. So we didn't have a particular theoretical framework to go or to use in this particular analysis. And while reading their explanations and descriptions of their work, we found 5 motivational themes. Firstly, many of the artists were motivated by discovery and curiosity. So they were exploring these tools that they found and what are the limits. Some of them experienced that there were certain transformations in their creative work processes. Thirdly, there was a lot of reflections about societal roles and responsibilities. Some really pragmatic reasons, like resource opportunities that supported or encouraged use of AI tools. And finally, some mentioned that they were inspired by these opportunities for extending human boundaries of creativity and embracing certain loss of control in their artistic work. And I will now tell you a little bit more about each of these themes. So in terms of discovery and curiosity, 14 out of 19 artists mentioned something in this frame. So this was a very particular, important motivation for many of them. Basically, it would contain just exploring what a new tool can do and what a kind of expressions it allows. And many artists found it inspiring that there are no established rules with particular tools. So there's no set limits to what should be done or how things should be done, that they were freer to do things their way, which was inspiring. But artists being artists, they wanted to go even further. They wanted to see if they could hack the models and stretch them and bend them and make them, quote, do something that they weren't intended to do at all, unquote. And an interesting side effect of all this exploration was that, especially when the material was collected by the artists themselves or maybe created by themselves, they would have these walks in their own latent spaces and then gain insight into their own material and how it forms and what it contains. One artist said that what I felt AI allowed me to do is to have a much better intuition of what my material is and how does it look like, what is its shape. A second common motivation was that certain tasks could be automatized, and that was empowering. It either allowed working at scale or it allowed artists to do things that they wouldn't have the time or resources to do otherwise. But then there were also a lot of artists who said that this is just another tool among many others that we've been using, are still using, that there's this continuity of practices. And these artists in particular wanted to downplay the role of AI being something radical and revolutionizing, that it's rather just another tool in their toolbox. I will come back to that notion in a moment. Thirdly, many artists wanted to participate in sort of general societal conversations about AI, and they experienced concerns and critical views on issues like lack of transparency, lack of technically robust and ethical models they could choose, or how the private corporate ownership of algorithms was controversial in generally. One that expressed that they really used AI not strictly as a tool, but really as a subject. So they wanted to use AI in order to talk about AI. Or technology more generally. And another one pointed out that this is exactly the reason why she thought that artists should be using AI, that they are part of this conversation about how technology is being developed, how it's being discussed about that they are not left out of the places where things happen and decisions are being made. But many were worried about their artistic integrity, especially when you have a tool that can create a lot of content, but when you're losing some of your control of the process. And they emphasized that it is important to have the aesthetic and conceptual intention in line with the characteristic of that particular model, that this is how they secure their own integrity in the work that they do. And finally, some of the artists wrestles with dependencies that are inherent with a lot of AI models, especially how they are closely tied to commercial institutions. So one chose the tools that they use so that they would not be dependent on any device manufacturer X or software manufacturer Y. And then that allowed them to not constantly think about what that entity or institution wants or allows others to do with that tool. So they gain some independence by choosing tools in a particular way. Some pragmatic reasons would be resource opportunities. So there would be collaborations either on the artistic side or perhaps on the technical side that artists gain some support for how to use the models that they have chosen. A lot of times it was also funding or institutional partnerships or commissions that either enabled or prompted them to use AI in the first place. And then some of the artists noted that they found inspirations about how AI changed certain fundamental principles of how they work artistically. On lower end of the spectrum would be that they appreciated the elements of surprise and unpredictability of the models, so that they embrace this aesthetics of odd and unexpected, and that let them release some of the control of the process, and they found it interesting or satisfying or even addictive. Quote, what is nice about working with these things is that you sort of let go of your agency in terms of controlling the sonics, unquote. And then on the more extreme end of this spectrum, there were artists who were describing that they sort of worked with something that felt like a creative partner of some sort. And sometimes that forced these human actors to modify their own practices to accommodate the models and their restrictions and limitations. And there were a few that went even further, sort of reformulating their own understanding of what creativity is in this particular context. Saying, for example, quote, why do we need to make human-centered AI technology and art? Why don't we let AI continue with its own ways of creativity, unquote. But it's important to emphasize that, as we saw before, this is not the view of all of the artists. Some of them had a very much more practical perspective, and they would not accept this kind of anthropomorphization of the models, that they wanted to keep clear of that conversation. So this kind of shows us how the motivations with the artists are not straightforward. Even the people who actively chose to use AI models in their artistic work, they were not all enthusiastic about AI as such, or they were not the ones that were sort of the most eager to adopt the technology itself. The motivations were more complex. There were internal tensions between the individual needs and the collective, the aesthetically curious and the socially critical, and also sort of the techno-capitalistic and artistic perspectives in their work. And I think this has really interesting implications for design politics that we need to think about carefully and intentionally about who are these tools designed for and what kind of value sets do we integrate into designing them. And that brings me to the next case study. This is one about sort of critical case study in AI music. And what I'm going to show you is based on a talk that I gave at the AI Music and Creativity Conference in September. And I will present you with 5 provocations on how I think the developments of musical AI applications could benefit from closer self-reflections. I'll give you a second to read the comic. I don't know if you can read it on Zoom, but it basically says society provides, look, we created an AI that can write music and poetry and papers and create art and answer your questions in seconds. And then there's a user say that, wow, if that's possible, then women everywhere should definitely have access to basic prenatal care, right? And the society goes, well, let's see. But my particular example is around folk-rnn. I think you mostly know what it is, but I'll just summarize it quickly. It's a machine learning model, the neural network, basically, that models symbolic sequences of music. It was originally trained with a data set of about 23,000 transcriptions of Irish traditional music, and those were downloaded from a crowdsourced database, thesession.org. And the system is essentially there to generate more Irish sounding tunes that imitate and sometimes plagiarize those that the system has seen in training. And because it's portable and efficient, it can, in theory, generate an endless stream of Irish machine folk. And this is my first provocation. The big question is, what do we need this for? Who wants to create more artificial jigs and reels? And why would they want to do that? And in more general terms, where's the value in applying AI to music generation? Or even more importantly, can these systems be outright harmful to music? But if you would go back a little bit, the reason that folk-rnn uses Irish music in the training data is that it was really convenient. There's enough transcription data available. It was on that database, ready to be downloaded. It's already in a suitable format and ABC notation. And as we know, this having the data is a key requirement for this kind of data-hungry models. But also in the Irish music, the melodic and harmonic and metric structure are consistent, and the individual works are not very long, so they are in a suitable format for the model to be able to work with. Most of the repertoire is already in public domain, so we don't need to worry about copyrights. And then there's this living practice around Irish traditional music that we can have these conversations and ask for comments and feedback from living community, which is a nice extra. Now, the second provocation is that the users of the session.org were not really asked whether they wanted their hand-entered data to be used in this particular way. They weren't asked for permission. There was no consent given. And they most definitely did not ask to have this kind of service for themselves. And of course, they didn't get any direct compensation for it either, nor does the existence of folk-rnn seem to provide any particular direct value for them. So if we think about what is the reason for folk-rnn to exist, it's not really because we needed an unlimited supply of artificial Irish music, but it's rather that there was an interesting opportunity to test this particular model in this particular domain, see how well it could be performing. And in that sense, it's really more of an exercise in machine learning that an artistic tool. So maybe it's more of like a parlor trick than an artistic instrument. And a way of proving that is that there hasn't been an awful lot of material interest in this Irish music community in engaging with this model. it hasn't really found a tangible, meaningful purpose for the people at session.org, nor in the sessions that are happening in Irish pubs around the world. And currently, there seems to be consensus on this particular database at their discussion board that the moderators say they do not want any AI-generated tools on their database, period. So they have set their foot down on that, which means that from the perspective of the session.org contributors, this system is a solution in search of a problem. But there's another reason why we could think that maybe it's a good idea to think about first when you start playing around with someone else's cultural heritage, because sort of unwarranted and invasive use of music that belongs to a community can easily create an impression that it's okay to use to reduce someone's tradition into a set of data points and just run around and do whatever with it. And that sort of trivializes the richness of this tradition and the way it's being practiced around the world, and the decades of efforts that these communities have made in preserving and promoting that tradition. So in the best case, it's slightly inconsiderate or a little bit disrespectful. In the worst case, it can turn into kind of harmful misuse. Because we all know that data is valuable. And when we're exploiting data that belongs to an external cultural community and we're using it for purposes that are not in the interests of this community, we can label this kind of data colonialism. Now, data colonialism is what happens when social resources are extracted and appropriated, usually by someone who is in a position of power. And there's a negative effect that is independent of whether this action took place in sort of commercial pursuit or as a sort of innocent non-commercial exploration of the data. And if, of course, it's aggravated by the legacy of social and political colonialism that Ireland and Irish people have been subjected to throughout their history. So when the AI marketers talk about data as the new oil, maybe we should not just think about what financial potential it has for the venture capitalists, but also what kinds of social and cultural and political and environmental costs and harms and burdens it has brought to our planet and its peoples. And then the final provocation, there's a very concrete risk that the repetitive stream of automated imitations of Irish music starts blending with the original heritage repertoire. And that's not a trivial concern. That's exactly what the moderators at session.org are worried about at the moment. Because authenticity is a core value in Irish music. And losing track of what is real and what are mirror images can be very detrimental, especially for those newcomers in the field who are not, they don't really have their Irish radar fine-tuned for this kind of stuff. So this is clearly one of the cases where more doesn't necessarily equal with better. When we're drowning our cultural space with random quality content in monstrous quantities, it's kind of carcinogenic. And we have already seen this happen in visual domain and science fiction writing, where there's been such a proliferation of content that the platforms are just drowning. They don't know how to deal with all the material, and that in itself has been driving users away from previously really popular platforms and driving the platforms crazy. So this is not the kind of future we want, having so much AI generated content that no one has the time and resources to curate through what it is and what is worth saving or using or not. But this provocation is basically a result of an ongoing agonistic dialogue and debates that we have at KTH on what kind of responsibilities do we have as AI music researchers, where we try and think what are and what could be the benefits and harms of doing research in this domain. And our best conclusion so far has been to try and keep the broad questions of value and purpose at the forefront of what we do, such that we can choose to be mindful of what we do with AI music and how and where we use it and how do we label it. And we can study it and of course develop more systems to generate more of it, but we can also use those systems thoughtfully and to explore what these new concepts of art and artistry mean, not just for the existing music cultures, but also the ones that are also just starting to take shape. And this brings me to the last study that I'm going to present today. So we talk about AI so much today. And in the past couple of years, there's been more and more understanding that AI is something that we need to approach from the perspective of ethics. In the wider policy field, there is now a series of high-level AI ethics frameworks. There's one from UNESCO. EU has published guidelines for trustworthy AI. There's the IEEE guidelines and so on. There are several documents and declarations from national governments, nonprofits, companies, and so many others. But the problem is a lot of these basically have a set of principles. They do have significant thematic overlap. So we didn't seem to have some sort of a conclusion or agreement of where we would want theoretically AI to develop towards. But as many authors have pointed out, these are very abstract documents, and they give at best sort of philosophical grounding of what is the goal, but very little practical guidance of how to solve everyday problems and decisions, especially in creative domains, which are sort of niche in this particular policy field. And simultaneously, we have more and more incidents related to AI reported annually. In the past couple of months alone, we have these situations where there's been unsolicited AI replica songs that the original artists have absolutely nothing to do with. And we have the first law cases debating of how the sort of data scraping in artistic domains, whether that's fair use or not, and how that sort of regulation should be formulated. So in this work, we've been addressing the question of how do specific music AI teams relate to their stakeholders and the impacts their technology may have. And now when I talk about music AI, I'm referring to any range of AI tools that could be applied to generation or editing or analysis of music. Could be data-driven systems as well, doesn't have to be machine learning, for example, particularly. But the theories that we relate this to are, for example, the value-sensitive design framework, which is a socio-technical design approach that counts for values among a diversity of different user groups. And we have adopted the lens of care ethics and relational virtue ethics, which is basically bringing the focus on the moral salience of attending to the needs and values of a community, and especially marginalized populations within it. So not on personal virtue, but rather on the conditions and values of wider community. And then we derived some of the methods from stakeholder analysis, which is coming from management studies, but it has been used and it has found traction in many application areas. So in order to try and make ethics matter, we've been developing this novel tool called EASE, Ethically Aligned Stakeholder Elicitation. And its aim is to be a low barrier ethics analysis method that helps and supports developers of creative AI in identifying some of the impacts of their work. It's designed to focus on people or ethical patients of actions and decisions. And this is exactly the approach that's coming from care ethics, that we don't want to talk about abstract principles, but really on particular people that we can empathize with. And also talk about real life implications on individual projects and how power relations and value tensions are entangled in those. The tool is planned to use in a workshop format, which runs in 2 steps. So in the first step, we have the set of questions around the circle. And the participants go through the set of 9 questions, and through this exercise, they systematically identify stakeholders that are written on cards and then placed on the circular board that you can see here. These 9 questions are inspired by Data Ethics Canvas, and they have been reformulated into who questions. So basically, who provides the data, or who could be using this project or product, who could be harmed by it, or who could be positively impacted by it. And the idea of this is to help participants systematically expand and diversify the range of people that they see around their projects. So it's not just focused on harms, it's really also about the potentials of how the systems could be used for good. And when we talk about stakeholders, that's also a very wide open definition. They could be individuals, groups, populations, institutions, organizations of various kinds. And then once this step has been completed, the stakeholder cards are there then reorganized on a grid with power and interest, a qualitative power and interest grid that spans from low to high interest and low to high power, respectively. So it's not a quantitative; it's rather a method for separating some of the stakeholders and making it more clear how they relate to one another. So the placement reflects the respective power and interest that these stakeholders have towards the analyzed project, and so that they are meaningfully placed to with respect to one another. And in this particular context, we define interest as likelihood that the stakeholder tries to impress their expectations on the project, and power as a mechanism to influence the direction or decisions on that project. And when we do this process and go through this process, we start seeing disparities in power distribution between different stakeholder groups. And then we have a short set of discussion prompts that we can discuss further about how we could explore the power dynamics more, how could we take initiative to fix some of the issues identified. As an initial case study, we tested this model with 6 groups that work with AI music or with AI in musical context broadly. And some of them working with real-time deep learning systems for sound synthesis and manipulation, or symbolic music generation systems adapted to particular instruments. And these 6 volunteering teams that we got came from 5 different countries, and we had in total 70 people. Each of these workshops took about 90 minutes. And what do we find? Some of the stakeholders that were identified during the workshops were kind of groups and people you would expect, such as artists, data providers, users or listeners, research communities, various kinds of companies and employees in the music industry. But something that was interesting that came out of this is that not all stakeholders come in the same shape. So for example, this wide category of artists really included several different subgroups, like musicians and composers who are actively participating in developing these systems and testing them and using them. And there were musicians whose data or similar data was used in the system, but also artists whose works and styles are not represented in the data, so the system might not perform for their purposes equally well. And then also there were some lesser known artists that some of the workshop participants said that they would rather like to empower or encourage to use the systems. And then others that were trying to find loopholes in the system and sort of self-promote in excessive ways that the researchers did not want to encourage. And then walking in this sort of tightrope between how to support some subgroups and then maybe not enable other subgroups to work against others was a difficult one. Said one workshop participant, quote, "We can choose to give them as an artist more power in terms of how their sounds can be used," unquote. So one of the observations was that a lot of these decisions are such that they can be actively molded into one or the another direction. There's a space where things can be done differently. I should double check if I forgot to say something about this. Yeah, and then some other observations that came out from these workshops. There was a range of different use cases, so also different kinds of conclusions, but some of the teams explored opportunities of finding new use cases, such as physically or sensory impaired users, that they might be able to help. Some reflected on their own ability to affect some of the structural and inequalities and biases in the industry. And then acknowledging that the general public might not necessarily share the team's own internal values and views towards whether AI music or music AI in general is desirable. And then some teams realize that they need to work on defining their own values in order to be then build work on that. Very many reflected on the conditions of what is legitimate and responsible data use in AI research, and what kind of blind spots they might have in their own data management problems that they could try and fix. And then some teams noted that whatever the ethical stance of the project is at the moment, that might change if they choose to, for example, commercialize the project, and all of a sudden they are regulated by different laws and different ethical considerations. So overall, it kind of seems that EASE has been helpful in stimulating structured critical self-reflection. There were new stakeholder groups identified, new aspects of the work were discovered. Many groups said that they became more aware of the power asymmetries that require their attention, and acknowledged that there is this wide range of different kinds of social impacts and ethical impacts that a music AI application may have. And perhaps most importantly, they articulated these shared understandings of how they could start addressing some of the issues that they find, and found some more concrete ways to bring these ideas into practice. But we still have one really uncomfortable question. Is any of this enough? So in other words, there are some aspects that we don't know based on these workshops. We don't know if this particular instantaneous analysis really led to implementation of concrete changes in the research practices and development. We don't know whether the teams had the resources and the time and the knowledge to do that and implement those changes. And we don't know if EASE really was a sufficient tool for enabling all of this. So my argument is that we desperately need some of these low barrier tools to be able to start these conversations. And we should also be able to keep the conversation going rather than have it added as a band-aid when something bad happened. So in order to do that, we're next planning to start some longer-term collaborations with research and development groups, different projects that would be interested in working more on this. And this is where you could all come in. We're looking to run this EASE workshop with different projects in different kinds of contexts, and then take some time to evaluate after a while whether that workshop has led to some concrete changes in practices and cultures, and are there some new problems and hindrances that are emerging from applying these kinds of ethical principles in design and development work. And finally, if we could together try and establish some new practices that could help solve some of these problems. Eventually, I'm hoping that when we get a better understanding of the ethical complexities of development work in creative AI, that will not only help us solve individual issues in individual projects, but more so see if there are some domain-specific blind spots that we could collectively work on, and see if our regulatory frameworks for AI and creative AI and music AI in particular could benefit from establishing some industry-wide standards or self-regulatory measures or recommendations of some sort. So I'm inviting anyone and everyone who would be interested in continuing this work with us and these discussions to get in touch with me, because I think this is really the work that we can do around this will help redefine what creative AI ethics is and how it could play into the pipelines of developments. And to get this right, we really need all hands on deck. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, we'll see if this is audible on Zoom or anything else. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, we'll take some questions. We have this mic for the room. We'll keep an eye on the Zoom chat for anyone who wants to ask a question there. Do we have any questions on Zoom already?
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to meet you, actually. I don't know, I've used your EASE framework actually for my own research. And I have a number of questions, actually. So first one that I have, the application that I did is not generative AI for pure creative practice, but what I'm working on is using generative AI, or generally speaking, creative AI, for a sort of music therapy, like real-time music therapy, essentially. So supporting people that have chronic pain daily life. So I felt this kind of changed the angle a bit. And I was wondering, first question would be, would I need to integrate maybe with something else? Like, I felt this was enough, honestly, but I was wondering from your perspective, if there's anything else you think it might be useful. And another question that I had, I've run most of my analysis myself and my supervisor, essentially. And also this was like do I need more people? Like, do I need more people to integrate this and have more perspectives into the stakeholder analysis that I've done? Because I felt the work was really useful, and it changed the way in which I was shaping the project, and it changed the way in which I was looking at stakeholders, and it helped me integrate actually new stakeholders into the project from the start. So this was actually really useful. But I was wondering these two main points, actually, from your perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you tested the tool and that you found it useful. That's great news. I think one of the issues with the stakeholder analysis, of course, is that there's no absolute end to it. There's a practical limit to how many stakeholders we can include in the project, how many people we can talk with, and how many perspectives we can realistically integrate in a particular project. But I feel that there's a practical limit then that has to be drawn in a particular case then to see what resources are available and what is then the meaningful limit to how many stakeholders you would include. So there's no absolute answer to yes or no. If you have so many, if you have 5, if you have 10, if you have 100, that's going to be enough. But at the same time, I feel that there is certain point probably where you start seeing that the same questions start getting repeated. It's kind of that like interview methodology, the same, that you talk with different people, you have individual perspectives, and then in order to see if you start getting saturated results, that's when people start saying about the same thing. So that's one way of maybe evaluating that now we have reached a point where we probably have enough. But at the same time, I feel that just having that perspective that we should integrate this, whether it's a user study, whether it's a stakeholder interview, whatever you frame it with, to have those dialogues from the start or as early as possible and keep them going as we go. I think that is sort of the best tool that I have to recommend at the moment. As for the framework in itself, this is one suggestion. They have been different tools, different workshop formats for different kinds of use cases. I don't think EASE covers all the possible ends, and I already know that there are certain blind spots in this tool itself, like we don't talk about environmental perspectives quite as much as we possibly could or maybe should. But I think it's a useful starting point. And I can point you to some other frameworks if you want to take a look, if there are some other perspectives that they would open. There are a couple of more elaborate tools. What we aimed for with EASE in particular was that it would be sort of easy entry, so they wouldn't require hours-long debates and conversations and finding documents. And it would be sort of a tool where you get conversations started quickly. And I hope it's sort of be useful like that.
I mean, I think it's a great strength actually, because one of the limitations that I'm finding, like generally speaking, is that in environments like ours, we don't have many resources. Oh, yes. So in a sense, like we don't have many resources in the sense that, it might be just you, your research group. There might not be enough people to actually run this by, like infrastructuring, for example, like the kind of participatory way of like, we go talk institution. A lot of times we can't.
Yeah.
And so having this kind of entry points and easy to run kind of tools, I think it's very, very actually helpful, especially in these like more low resource environments that we might find ourselves in. So yeah, thank you for your work actually.
Thank you. Sort of thinking related to that, also having this perspective that we don't need to have all the tools and all the answers ourselves, but we can maybe try and search who would be the people that then know more about particular areas of use or particular problem areas that can be really useful. I'm all for dialogue.
So thank you for a wonderful talk. I've got 2 questions. One is kind of a maybe more concrete, which is having to do with your interviews. So it seemed like you interviewed artists that were from a number of different fields, media artists, musicians, and the like. And then you were talking about the motivations for using AI. I'm curious if there is some more granular detail. How do those motivations break down or vary across those different types of art? So were there, like in the music context, is it more likely, for instance, that someone might use AI in a kind of instrumental way as a tool, let's say, as opposed to in the media art tradition where focusing on the media as a kind of subject in a critical way is already baked into that kind of discourse. So I'm curious, I guess, about that breakdown of motivations along the different creative uses of it. And then the second question, and this is maybe more open-ended, is, this idea of creating more ethical ways of using AI or developing AI by including stakeholders, which certainly seems like a good idea, but I'm still wondering about the money and power dynamic of all of this. Like, who is the we here that are identifying the stakeholders, that are assessing their needs, that are where are the motivations for these projects coming? What's driving all of that? And is there a potential danger, even in the good intentions, of integrating these stakeholders into a system where the power dynamics are already so skewed in one direction that even their integration is actually further tipping the balance of power, because the only people that actually have the resources to maintain these big data sets or analyze them in productive ways to build tools around them are these, major sort of funding structures, right?
Yeah, that's the very good questions. Thank you. I'll try and keep both in mind. So the first question asked is there how diverse are the motivations, or how they are divided in different areas. Now that we had this set of interviews divided into so many different subdomains of art, I'd be wary to say that this particular domain is heavily represented in this particular type of motivation, simply because the subset of data on music particularly, or on visual arts particularly, is so very small. So there's absolutely some trends towards what you said, that media art tends to be more about talking on the covering as a topic the subject that is used as the methodology as well. So the connection there between the content and the tool is closer probably than it is in music. But at the same time, it wasn't so clear that this group of people would always fall into this motivation. There was a lot of sort of back and forth. And what I found interesting was also that there were people who would talk about inspiration and exploration and all that, how they were excited to use the new tools. And at the same time, just a few minutes later, saying that, well, actually, I'm really worried about AI. I don't know if this should be used in arts at all. And it's sort of these internal conflicts that the artists are struggling with, but I found really interesting. So that probably tends to point towards not being able to categorize artists into particular blocks either, that it's more likely that they are these tensions and frictions that we see within domains as well as between domains. As for the second question, that is a very good point. When we talk about stakeholders in general, we come to this question: who do we need to ask? Who do we want to invite to the table? And what happens when we invite particular stakeholders to the table? Which is why I think the second step of the workshop, of the EASE model, is useful, that we are more sensitized towards recognizing that giving voice to just any of the stakeholders is not the same as giving voice to the ones who need it more. And then being mindful of how to have the dialogue with the stakeholders that already have a lot of power. Now, there's of course no easy answers to either direction, but I think one of the issues where academic research in comparison to commercial development of AI music or our creative AI tools has an edge is exactly that we can ask uncomfortable questions, and we can bring into the surface issues that a company would not want to have seen in their PR world. So we have opportunities of starting these dialogues on issues that we see as important, and give voice to stakeholders that are not commercially profitable to engage with. So just having that sort of framing and mindset, I think is a useful way of approaching these issues. But yes, I don't think any individual tool or analysis cannot fix the industry inequalities. Those are problems way beyond. But we can try and work on individual levels, see if we can fix smaller problems one at a time and work towards better.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. You want to ask? Well,
Sure.
all right, I'll give it to Franco and then I'll ask afterwards.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was interested in maybe like a different approach that I'm not sure if you considered or not, or maybe. So this study probably has focused in artists as users,
Yes.
but what about artists as designers?
Mhm.
Like the counterpart of the appropriation of a model, especially because there are wide variety of algorithms, AI algorithms and machine learning approaches that actually are small enough to be run by not necessarily by companies, by
Yeah.
end users. So yeah, that was one question. And the second question is about the blended repertoires, which is something that, as you very well described, it's happening already in the visual arts domain. And I think it's going to happen anyways in the music domain. So yes, what perhaps it would be interesting to discuss if there could be something that we can put in place to decrease the damage or somehow, like deal with the situation. We have great algorithms that can generate new content, but we have also great algorithms that can recognize already created content. So yeah, these two issues I wanted to ask you about.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really, really good questions. So the first one, yes, I agree with you. There's maybe one of the downsides of thinking about stakeholders as in these boxes where you can categorize people in is exactly that you sort of lose the focus of how these groups are blended and overlapping. So we have, like in the interviews, we saw that some of the artists wanted to be part of developing the models exactly so that they could be independent of some commercial entity that might even just upgrade the system, and all of a sudden it doesn't work for the aesthetics the artist was striving for. Like this was one who wanted to have pictures with people with a lot of fingers. And now that the models are getting better at hands, that's a huge problem for her because she doesn't want that to happen. That is exactly what she's going towards, having this grotesque, macabre scenes. So that kind of independence is, of course, something that you can strive for or by using and choosing the models. And then, of course, we have these roles between who is a developer, who is a designer, who is an artist. They are oftentimes blended in a number of different ways. So I think this is something that we'll probably need to explore more as we go through the interview data, and also as we engage with these artists more and see how the roles are changing and what does it mean for our cultural spheres. And now I'm trying to remember what was the second question.
About blended repertoire.
Oh, that's right. Yes. I'm afraid you're probably right. To some extent, we cannot avoid it. But at the same time, there is, at least at the moment, when many of the generative music AI models are still, in a way, in their infancy. We're not quite there yet where we have the Beethoven symphonies written by a machine learning model on its own anyway. So I think there's still space for some sort of AI music spam filters, if you like. I don't actually like that term because it implies that AI music is spam that we want to avoid, but that's not the thing either. We have a range of different quality and type and style, but sort of to be able to recognize what is coming from where. And of course, that's becoming more and more difficult when we have, again, the sort of blended situation that the user is actually having their own input in the work. And that's coming from legal side as well, because the legal situation is that the copyright only applies when it's human-made, or mostly human-made, or enough human-made. And if it's automatically generated music, there's no copyright to it. So from a lawyer's perspective, this makes a huge difference. But then from the sort of musician's repertoire perspective, still, what is real? What is is it still real if we use AI? Is it still real if we use synthesizers? Why do we draw the line here? It's a lot of difficult questions we need to think about. But at the same time, I think in the visual world, we are further ahead in that situation. There's less that can be done. Whereas with music, we can probably think about some sort of labeling, metadata management, that sort of things that can be used to consciously make mark that this music is coming from a model with this kind of user interface, this kind of data. There's still ways to communicate that such that it maybe avoid some of that problems of getting blended repertoires. But it's a complex question, and its situation is changing all the time. So no definite answers, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Right. So thanks for that. One of the things that I was curious about early on, you made a comment about the motivations for artists to use AI, and some of it comes from funder mandates, that there are various commissions around the use of AI, for example, or various particular grant opportunities. And here we sit in an institution as part of a research group, a team of people who've come together largely because of public funding that's been made available by the UK government, specifically around AI generally, from which colleagues here have crafted a center around AI and music. And it's been tremendously productive, I think, to bring together this group of people doing this. At the same time, there is a kind of higher level directivity that I wonder if sometimes goes unremarked in some of these conversations about maybe I as an artist am using AI or creating AI systems to do this, and what are my ethical responsibilities. But the ethics probably start earlier on, when it's decided that AI ought to be used for certain kinds of things. And I guess what I'm setting up here is not a kind of yes or no question, let's just abandon AI, but maybe what I'd like to put to you as a provocation is, if you ran the funding agencies and you wanted to say this funding is available for things in the sphere of AI, but in a way that you think is likely to produce positive ethical outcomes and better stakeholder representation, for example, how would you craft funding opportunities like that? How would you bring the people in and support them to begin with?
I think that's a very relevant question. It's a difficult balance, right? Because on one hand, like one of the artists said, that we should have artists exploring AI artistically, exactly to have those voices in the table, and to have that sort of at the table, and have that dialogue going on. We cannot have those user groups excluded from how AI is being framed. And at the same time, by providing funding for AI, we invite artists that might not have had so much interest in AI to begin with to engage with that. And therefore, we create evidence of artistic interest in the area, wherefore then research and commission funding is coming. So we have this funny circle where no one really knows who's motivating whom. And is the money flowing in this direction because there is interest, or is the interest coming from the money flowing? And is anyone really thinking about this very closely? And I don't think there's a particular way of fixing that. We talk about AI so much; it's so infiltrated in everything we discuss in the media at the moment. It's just overwhelming. But I think that's sort of the conversation that AI can be used in ways that are more ethical or maybe less ethical is in itself already useful, that we can try and see what are the problems that we want to avoid, what are the methods that we currently have that we can maybe use to avoid those problems, or are there some ways where we can strive the development towards directions that are more desirable than others. As for the funding agency, I think you probably just need to say, this is the goal. Please see what you can do with it, because in the end, no one has the answers at the moment. What the ethical way of doing things is, and ethics is a moving goal anyway. Whatever we decide is ethical this year might be already a little bit different next year when we learn more.
Yeah. Any questions on Zoom? You can put in the chat or just start talking. No, nothing right now. Yeah, absolutely.
So this would be following up on the idea of, so where do the ethics lie? Is it, sort of at the level of the individual user, or at the level of the device maker that's trying to identify the stakeholders, or at the level of the sort of upstream funding structures that make all of this happen, right? I'm curious if in the stakeholder model, there's ever a point at which the policy becomes, I don't know, putting some kind of a stipulation on how that technology can be used, that it can't be folded back into like a commercial product, for instance, or some sort of a private interest, that some sort of like a divestment of the of the data, I guess, you know, or some sort of a something where the stakeholders don't just get sort of integrated into a system and as part of a design process, but rather the design process kind of gets divested and turned over to them in some way. I don't know if this makes any sense, but I'm just curious. Yeah, because it seems like if it loops back in to some sort of profitability, or if it loops back into some sort of a private interest, then even that sort of, you know, side detour through the stakeholder identification model, it sort of undercuts itself once it loops back into the power sort of funding mechanism, right?
Yeah, that's probably the case. And of course, especially if it's any sort of commercialized entity that we're talking about, that is the way companies function. They need to be profitable.
Right.
There needs to be some way of monetizing things that are being done. And if it's not profitable, then it's something that is very unlikely to happen unless the company is big enough that they can afford to have these detours and do all sorts of things. So yes, of course, that is one limitation to it, absolutely. And in ways you could frame it also that the more we know about our stakeholders, the more avenues we have of manipulation of our stakeholders, that knowing about them doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be benevolent and want to help them, but it could be exactly the opposite. Like big questions. I don't think I can answer them.
This discussion like makes me think that, you know, some of these things feel to me more of a design problem rather than a like an analysis problem. And I was wondering, would this be possible, for example, in an instrument like keys, to introduce design suggestions, like methodology suggestions? Because I feel, you know, part of the problems that I feel, for example, you are putting out are related to some participatory perspectives that you might want to take in some context. I'm not saying like this is but participatory design is has some ideas of infrastructuring, going to the main providers, like, you know, for example, you're working in industry, then you go to state providers that provide copyright laws, or you go talk to industry partners or things like that. While other perspectives that are more commercial, like UCD or things like that, like don't really think about this in this way. So it might be interesting in some context to adopt certain design perspectives, or even like, you know, let's say like, you know, directions within a certain design. So I was wondering, like, might it be interesting, like, you know, to have a way after you've performed a certain kind of stakeholder analysis to say, in your user case, like in your case scenario, it might be interesting to you to look at this methodology, this other methodology, this other methodology, for example.
I think that's a good idea. And there should definitely be some sort of follow-up, some continuation about how, well, now we have this information, this knowledge, what do we do with it? And I think that's part of what I'm hoping to continue with, and see what kind of tools would be useful for practical use cases, so that we don't just get stuck into having this philosophical tool and finding some text to some document that no one ever reads again, but rather to have it somehow be practically and pragmatically helpful for the individual use cases that we have in this domain.
You don't explain
Microphone. I was thinking like, yes, spam filters, but maybe XAI is also a possibility. Like, I've been recently to a conference in which there was a lot of talk about this into classifiers, especially, and the idea of like decision making related to AI. It's kind of a different topic.
Yeah.
But I feel it makes sense in a sort of way in which, like, in the moment in which we might not be able to make a pure classification, maybe using tools instead to allow users to understand what is happening into the AI might allow for more cautious decisions when, you know, interacting with something. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm just saying maybe.
That could be. And a lot of times I feel that it's about framing, it's about communication, it's about being able to see what's happening, and then having that agency to decide what you want to do. How do you want to use the tool or the data, if you want to be involved at all? But when you don't have that knowledge, when the communication is missing, then there's less agency to make those decisions.
Any final questions, either here or on Zoom?
Great talk, Anna. I really enjoyed that. You said this kind of tying back to the initial artist motivations and the interviews. You said the word addicted, and that like artists were addicted to using AI, and I thought that comparison was really interesting. Kind of like there's in like speaking of like to drug addiction, there's this concept of like chasing the dragon, or kind of like the imagination of what you think you're going to get versus the reality of it. And I'm curious whether that you know, like artists' imagination of what AI is going to do for them, what versus what they get, and how they like that causes them to try to re-engage with it in like this addictive fashion. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
We are at the moment working on analyzing some of the other parts of those interviews related to what changed in the artistic processes after and why while using AI, and also what kind of challenges the artists encounter. And I think that sort of relates to a question that's well, what kind of practical obstacles came their way? Well, how did they work around them? What kind of, to what extent and in what ways AI tools were useful for them or failed to be useful for them, or made things more complicated. We always talk about this, how automation is empowering, but this can be also a lot of iterations and way more time spent on things that didn't necessarily end up being so useful for the end result. So it's going both ways, but we're still in the process of analyzing those results. So I unfortunately don't have much more details for you yet.
Thanks very much for the talk. Obviously, with AI tools and music, there's quite a broad spectrum of things like folk-rnn, where it sort of composes the new music based on other music, versus sort of things where it's just like more of a tool, like in a plugin, for example. To what extent do you find that the sort of analytical toolkit that you provide needs to be altered when sort of considering the sort of broad spectrum of tools that are available with AI?
That's another thing that I'm hoping to test more when we get to run more of these workshops and see how the tool performs, and if the questions that we're posing are the kind of questions that really open up the right perspectives and the relevant perspectives. So in these particular 6 use cases, it seemed to be that we can get to the general sense of what is useful and what is new. But I'm hoping to get more insights into that once we have a like broader set of data and see. And I know that there was one particular use case where the workshop just didn't work at all. And I'm still not quite entirely sure what was it the project that we chose as an example? Was it the framing of questions? What went wrong? I don't know. But we do have one example of that as well. So that's probably something that we can then see when we have a longer experience with this tool, and when we develop it further, how could it be useful? Or maybe the other way around, that we should limit that this is useful only for these particular types of use cases and not try and test it wherever if it's not useful for those other ones.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Super interesting talk and a great discussion. So thanks once again for joining us.
Thank you so much.